The next item on the agenda is the draft submission on the National Disaster Resilience Strategy. And I kind of have to do a slight mea culpa here, because it took me until last night to read the strategy, to read what it is replacing, and to read the council submission. And I was a little bit taken aback at what it is replacing, and a little bit surprised that it didn't mention either Christchurch or Wellington as members of the 100 Resilient Cities Network, who have been working on resilience for a number of years, and has created a definition of resilience which is not bad, but slightly disconnected to the issues that we've been grappling with and included within our resilience plan. So what I would quite like, I mean, the submission itself is fine, but I think that it needs additional, it needs more of a sort of overarching statement, and I know that it has to be submitted by tomorrow. And so I've asked that we add this recommendation to request staff to seek approval from the Ministry that an addendum to the submission be submitted. It says at a later date, but I'd really like us to do it next, have it completed by next week. And I'll do it. I mean, I'm not asking staff to write it. I have written speeches on this. I have written articles on this. I kind of know it back to front, and I'm really happy to do it myself. So I'm not going to ask staff to do anything else. But I did want to comment on a couple of things, and I mean, I don't want to take up the time of the council, but has anyone else got issues around the submission? Oh, okay, right. Well, we'll go to the questions first before I sort of head into this area. Glenn and then Phil.
Thank you, Leanne. I'll try to keep this high level, and I realise it's a submission, of which part of that is readiness, and it refers to a document in which it talks about readiness and response, Rob, as part of the resilience. So I guess for a lot of the community looking at these things, they may be aware this is on our agenda. I'm thinking that a measure for them will be what happens next time there's a potential tsunami threat as we had. But there was a disconnect between Wellington and here. So how much confidence could I have that a strategy like this will actually address those disconnects?
Good question. I think this is what the Ministry are aiming with this strategy is a much more wider encompassing than the previous strategy. So we're talking about resilience as a whole, and I think the Mayor just mentioned around that. Yep, sure, the 3 priorities in this new strategy, one of those does heavily cover readiness, response, sorry, and that's going to be also addressed with the emergency management reform, which is off the back of the TAG review. So response-wise, I think there's more confidence now than there probably ever has been about interlinking, particularly around the AF8 scenario and the need to work nationally and definitely regionally. So I think the confidence is there. I think this particular strategy is much more encompassing than just a response component.
Right. And I may just ask, the first bullet point under key submission points in 3.5 talks about, into action by cascading items of critical importance, etc., etc. Is that what we're talking about, or is that another matter?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a strategy, and I think we need to make sure that there's a really explicit implementation plan, and that's about making sure that that comes from a national level, into group, through plans, so that we can actually implement and follow it. So we need a real detailed implementation plan to make this strategy effective. Yeah.
Phil?
Thanks very much for the work on this, Rob, and it's very important in terms of climate change and all the other potential disaster things. So I just wondered about the timing for which we're asking for, in terms of, and some differences in the, I guess, the objectives that are here. For example, the one on point 7, when I find it, I think is that would be by 2025, that measures to ensure safety and well-being of people. And then we go further down, I think, to number point 13, it's building a culture of resilience, including a future-ready ethos. That stepped out to 2030, and that just seemed to me to be a long time. And can we not, should we not be asking the government to pull that back further so it happens earlier?
Yeah, that's definitely the case, and I think that the figure's quite arbitrary in that it's linked to the Sendai framework, and I think that expires in 2030, so that runs from 2015 to 2030, and I think that's been linked to that, and the Ministry have reflected that in the comments. There is also a group level submission which Christchurch takes part in that, and those details of the report about, I think they're in the you know, what does success look like, and I think that a lot of the comments was around trying to take out those operational components from this strategy, the dates for those as well. I think there's also mention of the controllers to be trained by 2025. So some of those dates need to be really drawn down in the implementation plan. But at the moment, they're just, I think they're linked to the Sendai framework, which expires in 2030.
Which is one of my overarching comments. There's absolutely no reason why we should accept the length of the targets of the Sendai framework when we are perfectly capable of meeting every single one of those objectives in a much more defined timeline. I wouldn't wait till 2025 either, so which is one of the areas that I'm going to ask that you change in here, and that we, in fact, we just say that we disagree with all of the timelines that they are to cover the world. The Sendai framework is for every single country in the world, not just, I mean, a country like New Zealand, through the experience that we've had, we can be much more aspirational than that. And I would suggest 2021 with a report back to our international conference that we'll be having on said subject in that particular year.
You know, I just had one other point too, and that was just to ask Rob, like, clearly it's establishment of a structure at a national level, but I just wondered, in your view, is there enough emphasis on the grassroots role, or taking the people with you at a local level? Is there enough emphasis in this, on that? I just didn't always see it, that's all.
And I think that's the intent of this strategy, is that it can be read by the individual and that they are also part of this, and that we're making resilience a countrywide issue rather than just a civil defence issue. So I think that we do cover that in the strategy, and certainly in some of the feedback we've provided. Yeah, yeah. It is about the people, and I think they're quite explicit about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Pauline.
Well, look, I was just following on for the timeline to 2030, and I was looking at number 18, talking about understanding our infrastructure vulnerabilities, and I was going to support you. I think we in Christchurch should have a much better idea of how our infrastructure sits at the moment. Our drinking water infrastructure is probably more challenging, but we should be able to easily bring that deadline way forward, I would say. So I was just merely going to comment on supporting that.
Yeah. Vicky?
I'm just intrigued by the length of time this seems to take, given the latest IPCC report, and we're at 1.5 degrees of warming by 2030. This seems to be taking a look at a very long time horizon, when we know that far more frequent and severe disasters will happen, even just because of climate change, within the next 3 to 10 years.
But is that another reason to bring all the time frames forward to 2021?
Absolutely. I would have thought that would have been imperative. The second question relates to the coordinated view of this and local authorities adopting objectives aimed at building resilience in their city or district, but then having the potential in the government report for quite separate authorities that may go over an entire island for the three waters, which will be one of the biggest areas of disaster that we face. So you don't seem to have commented on the government's desire to take out the three waters from local government.
Yep, true. There's no specific comments around that.
But wouldn't you, if you were actually trying to coordinate responses within cities or districts, wouldn't you want to have control of the three waters, given the importance of the three waters in any major resilience framework?
And I think that would probably fall under the disaster risk component, which we're trying to get owned at a national level, but also at regional level, so we can drill down into all of our risks and not just the water component of that. So and I think that there's questions around governance and implementation as well, and I hope that they would be picked up in those.
So, but shouldn't we raise the issue that actually it makes no sense if you're looking at city or district-wide responses to ongoing and increasing issues, that the three waters are then somehow flicked off into a separate authority that doesn't relate in any way, shape or form to the city or district?
Yeah, I think that's the infrastructure component of resilience, so I agree. So are there any other ones? Because I've got several points that I actually think there are a couple of amendments we need to make today, and what I might do is just get, rather than approve the draft submission, just approve final sign-off on the draft submission. I don't know whether you want it for a couple of people or whether I'm happy. If you're happy with me signing it off, give the mayor total control. Right, Yanni.
Yeah, no, I'm happy for you. I know how much work you've done in this space. I think the well-being of people, and it's sort of touched on page 273, where they talk about people and groups who have particular needs or are likely to be disproportionately affected by disasters are engaged in planning and preparedness. And I just think, you know, the example of Christchurch just has huge lessons to be put forward in that regard. If you think of the inner city east, almost the lowest priority, not included in the blueprint really in any great detail. So I think, you know, I think it's really important that you do make reference to some of the things that lessons from here.
Yep.
And also the fact that actually people that I think the heritage, like it's really good to talk about cultural heritage, but actually the built heritage. And so I think the point that you've made previously, which I would hope that you would make in your submission, is the greenest building is a building that's left standing. And actually one of the huge devastations in Christchurch in terms of lack of resilience was the sheer number of things that got knocked over rather than retained for affordable spaces and places. So I know you're aware of that, but from a environmentally sustainable point of view, and from an affordability point of view, I think it's absolutely critical. So I hope you'll reflect that.
Right. So I think, okay, so there's a couple of things, and I didn't really understand this until I went back into the source documents. So this document, what's called the National Disaster Resilience Strategy, is actually the Civil Defence Emergency Management Strategy under the Civil Defence and Emergency Management Act 2002, which are required to be done for up to 10 years. So I'm going to suggest that this one be for 5 years. In fact, I actually think it should be for 3 years, and it should be reviewed in 2021. And the reason for doing that is that when you actually look at what it's replacing, and I know it's been a number of years since this was replaced, and it seems to have got out of alignment. But the previous statement under the Civil Defence and Emergency Management Act, the whole ethos of it is resilient New Zealand, communities understanding and managing their hazards. And all of a sudden this has turned into a top-down exercise. So it's stopped that whole, and it references bottom up, which I'd hate as a phrase. I prefer grassroots up rather than suggesting that it's local and community-based approaches. It talks about successful disaster risk reduction tends to result from a combination of top-down institutional changes, strategies and policies, and bottom-up local and community-based approaches. That is true. It's a combination of the two that does that, but it's an equal contribution. You know, so that bottom up, top down tends to suggest that there's a hierarchy. So I'd really like to see that changed and sort of highlighted. The other thing is that it states on page 12 the three of this, and this is of the actual reports. You've got to go into the document. The three components can be counted by a fourth component. So the three components are hazard, exposure and vulnerability. They make up disaster risk. But they can be counted by a fourth component, which is capacity. And that refers to the strengths, attributes and resources available to reduce or manage the risks associated with the combination of the other three factors. It's looking for strengths that exist in your local communities, the attributes, the resources that are available to your local communities. And then it goes on to say the main opportunity for reducing risk, and they completely ignore what they've just said, lies in reducing exposure and vulnerability, and completely ignores increasing capacity. Completely ignores it. So, I mean, and I really wished I'd read all this stuff in the weekend, but I didn't. And I'm now very keen for us to maybe fix that. All of the dates need to be changed. And it says at one point, our own submission says that this has got to be owned by the group. But actually, if it's owned by the group, it's not owned by the people. So I really want us to take quite a strong lead on this being a community-led and understood approach to building resilience. And it actually will do a lot more for our country than disaster risk reduction. But so if we can make some relatively quick amendments to you know, they're relatively simple amendments to make, and then I'll do the addendum for the following week. Yeah. Yanni, you're not Yanni.
Again, I'm going to start fining you for this.
Yeah.
I'll be a rich man by Christmas. Yeah, we look the same, do we? The question, is this just looking at disasters? In terms of natural disasters?
It specifically says that.
It's natural disasters?
Yes.
Okay, so it's specifically just for natural disasters?
Right at the very beginning of the... So most people haven't gone back and looked at the discussion document, so I think that what needs to happen in future is that...
Well, it just says the National Disaster Resilience
it would be useful
strategy.
to put the strategy and the draft submission online, even though you're not putting it on the agenda. So if it's in the hub, then councillors will read the... I know that you can just touch on it and you go straight to it if you touch... There's a link in it, so you can just touch the link. But what it says is that while acknowledging broad societal resilience is desirable for achieving higher living standards and optimal prosperity and well-being, this strategy is confined to the disaster aspects of resilience.
Yeah, no, that's cool. I was just... Because those two are actually interlinked, especially when you're
I
talking...
agree. I don't agree with the statement, but
Yeah.
it's what they're focused on.
I mean, and I think we should actually say that in our somehow, that, you know...
We'll do it in the supplementary.
You know,
There's nothing...
If people are going to be prepared for a disaster, they need to be resourced. If
Yeah.
they don't have the money to have resources,
But
they're not
there's
going to be
nothing
prepared.
in the staff submission that actually suggests for 1 minute that would be counter to that, so we'll put that in the supplementary.
Okay, good.
Phil?
I am pleased that there's reference, for example, to community boards, but I agree entirely with you, Leanne, that in fact this has to, and that certainly was absolutely clear at the symposium of the earthquakes last week, that, you know, it's essential for disaster planning that we take and involve people with us, and I think of the amendments that we make, and probably you signing them off, Leanne, that whole theme is going to be essential.
Yeah, I think there's just been a general sort of kind of I don't know. It seems to have been created in the absence of any connection to the symposium, to the lessons learned website that has been developed, and also the 100 Resilient Cities Network, which Christchurch and Wellington are members of. which is a shame. And of course the climate change imperatives as well, but that will be made clear.
Just a question to you on that. Just for example, the new president of Brazil is planning to log the rainforest, which is the lungs of the.
Don't ask me to stop him.
No. I'm just wondering if the 100 resilient cities are planning any action on that.
I don't know.
He's quite mad. Sorry, you're probably not.
Yeah, but you could raise that with our Chief Resilience Officer, because there may be a Chief Resilience Officer in Brazil. I don't know.
I suspect not now.
Yeah, but there may be somebody that you could connect with in that regard. So
It's just that the impact is on the entire world.
Dire.
Yeah.
Dire. Yeah. Not the only place in the world, unfortunately. All right, so given that you're approving, so is this going to be signed off jointly by you and me? Eh?
Yeah, we'll do.
Yeah, okay. So signed off by Mayor and Councillor Buck, and requesting staff to seek approval that an addendum. So and so that means if we can turn something around overnight, I'll have to do it by email, I'm afraid, because I've got National Council tomorrow. All right?
Yep.
Would someone like to move the resolution? Phil? Seconded by Mike. I'll put the motion. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. That's carried. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks for all the work